welcome back. Part 3. You've just got to survive this one more part before we can all go to the TAP social and discuss it in person. We are looking forward to that. Nicola and Sue will make sure that we remind everybody at the end of the date of that and some details, and then everybody can make sure it's in the diary. But here we are, part 3, structuring for success sessions. And we've been looking at the top layer of information that you need to survive the process of setting yourself up in business. And we've talked about all the legal and financial ramifications. And today we're going to move on to have a look at how you get funding into your company and all of the implications that those conversations around funding connect us to. So, pleasure to welcome back again Nicola McConville from Taylor Vinters and Sue Staunton from James Cope Creston, providing legal and financial wisdom respectively. And I'm just here to make sure that everything moves along. And for any of you who don't know me, I'm Cass Spence and I'm based at OUI, Oxford University Innovation, the tech transfer office for Oxford University. Okay, let's get started, shall we? Nicola and Sue, welcome back to the madness. And today we're going to do the most important bit is we're going to find some money to run these operations with. But this has its own challenges, of course. So you've set up a company and you're now raising the funds to get it going. So Nicola, what are the very, very important first steps that you need to take along this road, please?
So just looking very specifically at funding, just not recapping on everything we've said before about things like knowing what your duties are and that type of thing in respect of being a director or indeed a role as a shareholder. When you're going out to raise money, there are a couple of things that you probably need to think about. The first, which is a legal point, which kind of comes as a massive caveat on my part, is that what you can't do is go out and say, a bit like sometimes you see on Dragon's Den, I have developed this widget, the market for this widget is X, my product is going to be good enough that means within 12 months I'm going to have everybody signed up to buy my widget and therefore I value my company at Y. What you do have to do when you go out and raise money is be very careful about what you say, and that is because I've said before there are very few circumstances where there might be a direct action against directors of a company because liability is usually sort of limited to the box that is the company. However, if you are directors and you misrepresent what the opportunity is in respect of your company, then there can be a direct action against you from any investors who make an investment into your company and then regard you as having misled them or misrepresented to them what the opportunity is. And that's why when you go out and you create things like investment memorandum or you go out and you do pitches, there's some wording that you really need to have in place, which warns those people about the risks related to investing into early stage companies and also complies with the various regulatory requirements that exist around being able to go out and ask people to part with their money. And there are different rules for people who aren't used to investing to people who are used to investing, sort of whether they're, regarded as sophisticated or high net worth. There are various exemptions to that and also exemptions to regulated investors as well. So that's just my first point. Just make sure you're legally compliant before you go out and start sort of persuading people to write checks. And then it's like, well, what are they going to write checks on? What's going to be the basis of them making a decision? And a key part of that is going to be what you tell them the opportunity is. And in order to be able to do that, a sort of pitch deck or an information memorandum is a key part of that. But equally, a key part of that is your business plan. And so what do we mean by a business plan? Is it literally just something written on the back of an envelope going, well, it kind of looks like this and it might end up like this and it's going to be like this and this is going to be the time bit? Or is it a little bit more detailed? And it's a little, surprisingly enough, it is a little bit more detailed. It might start on the back of an envelope, but you will definitely need to sort of expand it in order to get any credibility with investors. So what do business plans contain ordinarily? So there'll be an explanation of what the opportunity is and an explanation of the team. But then there will also be, and this is how we see our story panning out. This is our pathway. This is what we need on day one. In 6 months' time, this is what we think we're going to need, both in terms of resource, whether that's financial resource or people resource or asset resource, if you need to, purchase certain equipment, or collateral if you're going to enter into some kind of development agreement or sponsored research agreement, by way of example. So it's the pathway of where the company starts now, where it's going to go, and actually what you're going to use the money that investors are going to give you to achieve. It is a roadmap. It is absolutely a roadmap from day one to day whenever it is. What I would say is it is not unusual for these business plans to change, particularly in early stage companies, and investors recognise that. Investors who are used to dealing with companies at this stage are used to and have an understanding that actually the world changes and different things will come into play, which may mean that business plan goes off track slightly. For example, if you can't recruit quickly enough or recruit the right person. However, that doesn't mean to say you can basically write what you want in the business plan. And one of the reasons is that when you bring on board, it's not only the misrepresentation angle that I previously mentioned, but also when you take on board money from an investor, there will be various documents in place. And one of those documents will be the investment agreement, which will contain warranties, which are basically statements of fact. And you will be asked to warrant the business plan. So you won't be asked to guarantee, to crystal ball gaze and to guarantee that you will do these things in this time frame and have these results. But what it will examine is whether those opinions that you've expressed and the beliefs that you have put into those documents can be reasonably held, and that you've got no reason to think that the company won't progress on the track that you have identified to the investors in order for them to exchange with their cash to be part of that journey.
We've got a comment stroke question, which I'm going to take at this point from John. So he said, for the larger businesses I've worked for, we've put a slide at the beginning of every presentation that essentially states that any forward-looking statements made in the presentation are predictions only and may not actually occur. Should we put in something like this in all of our pitch decks?
Yes. There is also some fairly standard required regulatory statutory wording that also talks not just about forward-looking statements, but actually also the caveats that you make about who you're presenting this information to. So if you are presenting this information to what we call retail investors, sort of community investors, individuals, then there are a different set of protections that the law affords them in comparison to, for example, high net worth, sophisticated investors, regulated investors. And so what you actually should have is the appropriate wording depending on who that audience is. You also need to have processes in place that if you are making presentations to, for example, an individual who you believe to be exempt by reason of the fact they are sophisticated or a high net worth, both of which are sort of defined terms by legislation, that you have undergone that process to satisfy yourself that they fall within those categories before you make the information available to them, which you can do by way of example by asking them to tick a self-certification, sort of box before they can see a pitch deck or before they have access, for example, to a data room.
The next task, of course, is to have a think about where the money you need is going to come from. Sue, can I get you to talk through the various different sources that we might tap?
Yeah, absolutely, Kat. There are a number of different types of money that you might try and access, and which have very different characteristics. Grant income, which is what's called non-dilutive, in that it doesn't affect your ability to raise money in any way, doesn't dilute or reduce the percentage of shareholding that, say, the founders have got within the company. So to that extent, it's really useful. And grant funding tends to come from governmental type sources. So institutions like particularly Innovate, that oversees the majority of funding from UK government into entrepreneurial businesses. Lots of different strands. You have to keep looking at their website to see what's going to be relevant to you because it changes all the time. The problem with Innovate grants is that there is masses and masses of competition for them because everybody would like to get one, because essentially it's free money. All you have to do when you get a grant is to comply with the terms of the grant and to do what they're asking you to do in terms of your research and development. Other sources of grant funding that are worth looking for, if you've got a very specialist technology that will benefit a particular group of individuals or industry, then you may well find industry-sponsored agencies that will be offering grant funding. If you're in life sciences and looking at particularly diseases, then you might find a charity that funds research. And so obvious examples of charities that give grant funding are such as the British Heart Foundation, Cancer Research, and kidney research. And they're looking, as they raise the money, they're looking to put it out there to actually further research and development. So they may well assist you in terms of providing grant funding for your business. The thing though to be aware of with grant funding is not only it's difficult to get, it's really well worth locking in with people who've already got the funding or who are experts in terms of applying for the funding, because it's just like any sort of competition. You have to know the rules, and the rules can be very detailed, and it's slipping up on those rules and not filling this bit in or that bit in on the application can actually scupper your chances of getting there. Second one, which is more unusual to find actually in a startup business, is that of debt funding. So the overdraft or a bank loan, something like that, simply because you won't, as a startup, have a track record. There used to be opportunities where startups could get funding, providing there were personal guarantees given by the directors or shareholders, but it's very, very unusual nowadays. In terms of debt, the most likely debt that you would be able to get as an early stage business would be in terms of, say, leases for equipment, hire purchase, and they would require then evidence of the support from your investors, so your normal investors. So I think that's not something that I would bank on in terms of source of funding for yourselves. And the other thing also that one needs to think about with grants is that they quite often are looking for match funding. So you can't just have a grant in the business. You may need to either put up money yourself to match that or access other investor funding to go alongside. And then we come on to the third source of funding, which is probably the most prevalent at this stage of development for business, and that's what's called equity funding. So funding that comes into the business that's put in by external parties to the business in return for shares in the company and participation in the company. One, the difference between equity and grant funding is that the equity funding will reduce the percentage of the company the founders have. And so the equity investors will take a proportion of the business and they will own that proportion of the business. So when the business is sold, they get to participate in the sales consideration as well. And we'll talk a lot more this afternoon about exactly the rights of equity shareholders and how all those competing rights work together.
You talked about all sorts of funding there. Nicola, what types of dilutive sources of funding do you see?
So as Sue mentioned, dilutive funding is ostensibly where you are selling shares in the company to an investor. And I think one of the things that we sometimes come across is people not necessarily understanding that these are new shares in the company. Sometimes people think this means that they are selling their own shares in the company. There's quite a significant distinction, not least if you sell your own shares in the company isn't getting any money, you are getting the money, so that doesn't exactly enable the company to have the cash flow that it's expecting as a result of raising investment. And so what the company does is it creates new shares and it issues those new shares to investors. So it might be if you have, 100 shares in issue in the company between, say, 4 shareholders with 25 shares each, and then you have somebody comes in and wants to take a 20%, sort of stake in the company. What you would do is create an additional 25 shares and to take the total to 125, and then you would have that incoming investor owning that sort of new pool of 25 shares. So that's the first thing in terms of a really sort of basic nuance of being what we mean by somebody taking equity in a company in an investment context or primary investment context. Later down the line, as companies get more sophisticated, you can move on to what we call sort of secondary finances, where actually people do sell shares in a company, but that's much further down the line, Series B, Series C at the absolute earliest. there's a couple of things connected with that, though. And the first is that in relation to equity funding, it requires somebody to put a valuation on the company. It requires somebody to say, okay, this company is worth X, and therefore if I put in Y, I am going to own a given percentage of it. And that's not always straightforward, particularly when you've got really early stage companies. And so what we sometimes see are some different types of instruments being used where valuation isn't certain, or where somebody doesn't want to put a valuation on something because they, quite frankly, just don't know what it should be. And the sorts of instruments that we see in relation to those are what are sometimes called safe notes. So they're equally advanced subscription agreements. And that's a bit like paying a deposit for some shares in the future. So somebody will give the money to the company. It's not a debt, it's a deposit that when the company does go and do a fundraising with a valuation that has been set by a lead investor or an institutional investor, that deposit that they have paid turns into shares, but it will turn into shares normally at a discount to the price being paid by the lead investor at that fundraising, at that future fundraising event. And the reason that you get a discount is because basically you've put your money in at a relatively high risk stage of the company, and that risk is rewarded by you then getting this reduction in the price of the shares that your deposit turns into. The reason that I sort of talk about sort of both safes and advanced subscription agreements is there is a nuance between them. So safes we see quite often, sort of US investors will want to put money in by way of a safe. The Y Combinator safe is a fairly well-known instrument for doing this. So it's a simple advanced funding for equity. I can't even remember what SAFE stands for. We just use SAFE all the time now. A simple agreement for future equity. Sorry, I remember what SAFE actually means. I'm so used to talking in acronyms, I then forget what the acronyms actually mean. Like I say, fairly well established, simple agreements, etc. However, the challenge that you have, particularly in the UK, is that if somebody wants to participate, and they might be, by way of example, a business angel who wants to sort of have the benefit of not putting a value on the company today and having the benefit of a discount in the future, that doesn't, on the face of it, comply with the SEIS and EIS reliefs, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which are pretty fundamental tax reliefs that most UK domiciled business angels will look for. And so what you can do is you can have a form of a SAFE, an advanced subscription agreement, which you can make EIS compliant. However, there are a number of conditions around that, not least that deposit needs to turn into shares within 6 months. So there needs to be either a funding event within 6 months that causes the trigger of that conversion, or there needs to be a mechanism that says after, 5 months and 29 days, this converts, and this is the mechanism that we're going to use to convert this deposit into shares. So different sorts of advanced subscription agreements. They're not debt. It is an upfront payment for shares. You just don't know how many shares you're going to get. The other instrument that we see when somebody isn't certain about what valuation to put on a company is something called a convertible loan note. So a convertible loan note does not qualify for SEIS or EIS. So you're only likely to see a convertible loan note coming from somebody, an entity or an individual who isn't interested in the SEIS or EIS tax reliefs. It might be an institutional investor, by way of example. They're usually for, I would say, sub £1 million. And the way that a loan note works is slightly different in that it is a loan to the company. So it is a debt that somebody can, in the future, if they chose to, ask for repayment. But the way that convertible loan notes are generally structured is to say, we, the funder, will give you this money now, we will lend you this money now. However, in the following circumstances, this money will automatically convert into shares in the company. And again, they will expect a discount on the price at which their loan turns into shares. The other thing to look out for with convertible loan notes is time frame, valuation, interest, redemption payment, redemption penalties. So the future fund, that was introduced in lockdown number 1, as I call it, actually the way in which they supported businesses was through convertible loan notes, but they've got a 100% redemption penalty on them. So in the event with a future fund convertible, in the event that you don't repay it within 3 years, or it doesn't convert within 3 years, there's a whole stream of things that can happen. But if you chose that you didn't want to have them on your cap table, that you wanted to be able to repay the debt as opposed to diluting your equity, you could do so, but you would have to pay 100% redemption penalty. That in itself is quite unusual. I think there was certainly a number of eyes raised amongst the legal community when those sorts of terms started getting rolled out by the Future Fund, and then every venture capital fund decided that that meant this was the new market standard. I can safely say that we have now moved back from that market standard. But in terms of discount, and somebody's just asked the question, I would say a 20% discount is pretty much market. Sometimes you can sort of see 15%. Sometimes what you see is you'll see 20%, and then that assumes that the convertible loan note will convert within 12 months or at a particular valuation. And in the event that it doesn't convert within 12 months, what you might start seeing is that discount going up to reflect the fact that obviously it's taking the company longer to secure that investment round than perhaps everybody anticipated. But yeah, so CLNs don't qualify for EIS or SEIS. They are a debt. They can be repayable. Sometimes they'll carry interest. Sometimes they'll carry a redemption penalty. They almost always will have a discount in there. And I think the thing with CLNs is really just, to be honest, take some legal advice as to the various ramifications of those. So we've spoken quite a bit about this concept of dilutive funding, sort of selling shares in your company. In order to actually take on board true equity funding, so the issue of these new shares, you will need to come to a conclusion or an agreement as to what the valuation of your company is. And so, Sue, I don't know whether you're able to shed some light on the mystery of valuation metrics.
Nicola put her finger right on it when she said the mystery of valuation metrics, because the concept of valuation and the practice of valuation is very much a combination of science and art. And the art is probably a black art. The way in which companies are valued essentially depends very much on a negotiation at the end of the day between the vendor, i.e. the founders of the company and current owners of the shares, and an incoming and prospective investor, and what they're willing to pay for what. At a simplistic level, when we're at a funding round and we're thinking about what is the valuation of the company. Let's say that the company today is worth £1,000, and that's before the valuation comes in. Then an investor puts in £250. The proportion of the company that they would then own would be 250 divided by 1,250, or 20%. What the valuation does is to establish that benchmark before the investment comes in, and determines the proportion of the equity, proportion of the shares that the incoming investor is going to take in the company. Now, I said just now that arriving at a valuation is very much a combination of science and art. It's particularly, valuations for mature businesses that are revenue and profit generating is very much more simple than a valuation at this stage. And that's because a profitable revenue generating company will have a track record. They'll have a track record in terms of its profit stream, and therefore the dividends that will accrue to any investor who comes in or shareholder who comes in. It will also have track record of raising funding, and you'll be able to see the development of that company and how its management team have dealt with difficulties and successes within the business. There's a lot more information to be used that can feed into a very scientific calculation. In the circumstances of those much more mature businesses, and particularly those, for example, on a public market, then it's conventional to be using a couple of different metrics. One would be the assessment of the net asset value, and that would be particularly relevant where the company is very asset rich. Perhaps it's got a lot of physical buildings and land in it, and also using a metric which is a multiple. And dependent on the industry, you would use a multiple either of revenue, so the income that comes into the company, or its profits. So that's its income less its expenditure. And it's particularly when we're talking about expenditure, we're talking about recurrent expenditure, the items that are used to generate the profits of the business. And multiples will vary. There are industry standard multiples. That's what typically you look at. For companies that are pre-revenue and that are what I call semi-mature pre-revenue companies, so perhaps they've been in existence for 3 or 4 years, but the end is in sight, as in we can start to see the point at which they will start to generate the revenue and the profitability. And in those cases, you might use what's called a discounted cash flow model, which means you look at when they're going to start to generate profits, and then you work back using an appropriate discount rate, which again is, there are various numbers banded about. I see somebody in the comments has said, is 20% an appropriate rate? It depends on where we are in the economic markets, if I'm absolutely honest, and also as a result of that, what's happening within your very specific sector within the early stage tech market. There can be quite a lot of volatility in the markets, and that then flows through to the discount rates that are typically being used. It also depends on how close you are to revenue generation. So there are some startups and spin-outs that start to generate revenue very, very quickly from inception. There are others, and those will typically be those in the life science market, who will take quite a while to become revenue and profit generating, simply because they have to go through clinical trials and various other regulatory approvals. Those become far more challenging to apply sort of discount rates to. And that's when you sort of fall back onto the art side of how you calculate a valuation for a company. So if I just turn to the art side of it now, and then I'll come back because I see there's a couple of questions that have been posted. So the art side about it is really pulling together data and information that is much more subjective from across the sector that you're occupying. And what we tend to do when we're looking at early stage businesses is really to look at comparators within the sector and look at what they're achieving. So let's say you've got a business that is working on a particular antimicrobial therapy, then we would be looking at other very early stage antimicrobial businesses and what sort of valuations have they managed to achieve. And there are quite a few sources that you can find online that will talk about, X company raised Y amount of funding at this valuation, but you have to do quite a little bit of digging. So you might find out how much company A raised in terms of its funding, but you might not know what proportion of shares it sort of gave away for that. And then to find that out, you then have to look through Companies House, or there are some very good reports that do pull that together, that you have to subscribe to. And I suspect that the university can probably help you to get access to some of that data through the libraries and so on. Ultimately, though, and this is so you can amass all this information, and you come up as the founder of the business with an idea as to what you think the valuation of an appropriate valuation for your business is, and you sort of put it out there, and you say to potential investors in your business plan or in the dialogue surrounding you talking to them, your pitch, we're offering X% of the business for Y amount of money. It's entirely up to you as the founder to sort of, select what the right number for you is. Then investors come back and they either say, no, that's too light for us, that's not sufficient because we're taking a significant risk in investing in you at this stage, because it's going to take 10, 15 years before I start to get a return on my investment, or they start to negotiate with you. Because ultimately, an investment in a company from a third-party investor, whether they're a serial investor or a professional investor, such as a venture capitalist, is very much similar when we come down to it to buying a house. Somebody will put a price out there, and then it's up to the purchasers or investors in this case to determine whether they think that that's reasonable. I think it's fair to say Nicola and I see a lot of horse trading going on at this particular stage, because it is just very, very difficult to pin down what an appropriate valuation is. If somebody had asked me a question about, what's the sort of valuation that I could expect to get for my early stage tech company spin out 7 or 8 years ago, I would have said that on your first fundraise, you would typically expect to give away, sell between 20 and 30% of your initial share capital to your first round investor. That doesn't give you a valuation, except in the sense that you are providing the investor with 20 to 30%, let's say 25% of the business, for whatever funding it is that you need and the company needs in order to get going. Because without that investment, you're not going anywhere. And that was very much what we would see very typically, is that, you know, whether it was 250,000 that an investor was putting in or $1 million, somehow the valuation would always come back that they had between 20 and 30% of your company. More recently, that market position has changed, and we've got investors who are prepared to put in more significant amounts of money than used to be the case at seed round. You will see that if you look at, certainly in Oxford, if you look at some of the investments that are made early doors by Oxford Science Enterprises, which has slightly upturned the sort of former metrics that we would have had. There have been one or two where first round investment has gone over 40, 50% from one investor. It's not so common now to go above those, because I think we then start to get into different territories, which is once somebody owns over 50% of your company, then you become a subsidiary of them, and then all sorts of complications arise, not least that you also would no longer, as a spin-out company, be able to get the small companies' research and development tax credits, which are very beneficial in terms of funding your R&D, or indeed you wouldn't be able to offer share option schemes and so on to your employees as incentives. There's lots of different balancing things. But coming back to the valuation, you know, it really is very much a negotiation. There are lots of factors in there. You need to think about, you know, what's the risk that the investor's taking? How far is the company from revenue and profit generation? How much money do you require to get to that point? So is this your only round of funding, or are you going to have a series of rounds of funding, which will then subsequently dilute the original investor? How long is it going to take to get to an ultimate exit? Then come back to a couple of the questions that have been asked by you. Is there an industry standard for the discount that's provided? 20% is not unusual at the moment, but as I said, you know, we're in a very volatile market, you know, from an economic point of view, an industrial point of view, and this will be moving around, so you need to be looking at comparators very, very closely. And I also think that it's very difficult to be ultra sophisticated and scientific in the first round of funding. That then brings me on to the next point, which is there an idea of a rough range of revenue multiples for tech startups at seed and Series A? It is very, very specific in terms of what your very specific sector is. And you have to keep very close to what's going on in the market. So there will be very different revenue multiples for something perhaps that's in a digital environment and perhaps in, let's say, in fintech within that digital environment, as opposed to a early stage tech startup that might be in life sciences, drug development. Even within there are more fashionable companies than others. So a couple of years ago, if we'd got a company that was developing vaccine, it was an early stage startup that got a new technology platform for developing vaccines to deal with COVID, I can assure you that would have had, you know, a very different multiple to a company that was working on kidney cancer at that particular point in time. And now, again, different from where they were at that point. So I'm not going to give actual numbers because I think it sets people off on the wrong course, but I think it's all about research and keeping close to the market, but also bearing in mind really strongly at this stage, at the spin out stage, there's a lot more art than science to what you're doing. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is a large range. So are we seeing companies giving away more than 20% of equity at seed stage? I think that it's pretty consistent that companies do give away more. As a giveaway, I mean, they're selling 20% of equity at the seed stage. Yes, it is. There are one or two. There's a recent exercise for a company looking at what was going on in their particular segment of the market. There are one or two that, for particular reasons, get lower than 20, but it's very unusual. It's complex. It's something worth talking about. When I'm talking to my clients at this sort of stage, I would always say, don't get hung up about it, because what you're doing is setting your foot on the first paving slab of what is going to be quite a long journey. And you will be taking in quite a lot of investment typically through that journey. You will work out, I think, quite quickly that having even 5% of ultimately of a very large pot is worth a lot more than having 100% of what is a small pot, because you haven't had the funding to develop them.
And I think I would just sort of echo what sort of Sue says, is that I think the other thing that I see founders getting very concerned about is, well, hang on a minute, I now only own, or this type of thing. And actually, one of the things to bear in mind is that doesn't necessarily mean that's what your end percentage is going to be, because there are things like share option schemes, equity incentive schemes, etc., that actually can enable that to be redressed in the future. So it doesn't mean to say that's, you've reduced your shareholding by reason of bringing on equity investment and that's all you're ever going to get, because actually investors will definitely want to incentivize you to remain engaged with the company and to be dedicated to the company, and a way of rewarding that is through the use of equity incentive schemes. And just in terms of the amount of capital injection, because otherwise we could genuinely just sit here and talk about this for a very long time. So yes, it will depend on how much is being put in. Yes, it will depend on what the valuation is. The valuation will depend on what sector you're in, where you are, sort of something that is, sort of has managed to fund itself with non-dilutive grant funding for 3 years and has established beyond, sort of proof of concept, will be very different from a company that's 6 months old, hasn't had the benefit of, by way of example, those innovate grants or sort of other funding. The way in which you have to agree ultimately, obviously, with an investor as to a valuation before they will part with cash in exchange for shares. And if you've got an oversubscribed round, well, guess what? The bargaining power is in your hands. But if you don't have an oversubscribed round, then you're bargaining and you need that level of cash, or a minimum level of cash, then, so your negotiating position with regards to bringing in that minimum level of cash is somewhat hampered. And that is where we see things like advanced subscription agreements and safes and CLNs coming in, because actually nobody knows. And so it's like, well, we'll just kick it down the road and we'll work out what the value is later. But it really is art over science at this really early stage, and it becomes much more scientific at a later stage when you've got more market comparators, more market and a greater market established.
That all makes sense. So you've been through the process, you've worked out your valuation, you've coaxed your investors in, you've got all the paperwork signed. How do we govern the relationship with these investors, so between the company and the investors?
So what you have is some fundamental governance documents. And so you will have, really broadly speaking, a shareholders agreement and articles of association. And sometimes, sort of shareholders agreements might be referred to as subscription agreements in certain contexts, or investment agreements. But essentially, there will be a document, which is a private document. It's a private agreement between shareholders in the company. So it's not just the investors in the company, it's the investors, the founders in the company that will be a party to this agreement. It's a private document, so it shouldn't need to be filed at Companies House if your articles are drafted appropriately. What a shareholder agreement does is it's quite operational in its focus. It sets out who owns shares and why they own them. Are they a founder? Are they an investor? Are they an institution like the university, by way of example? It sets out who is entitled to what information about the company. So actually, under the Companies Act, shareholders are only entitled to quite a limited amount of information about the company. And so what a shareholders agreement does is takes that concept and expands it. And particularly when you start bringing on institutional investors and they have their own reporting requirements to their own investors or to professional bodies or that type of thing, then you will see these information requests becoming quite sort of specific in some cases to enable them to comply with their own reporting requirements. Information rights are in there, who's financial, and information rights are usually around financial information, management information in terms of access to board packs and board minutes, any significant developments within the company, quite possibly a report against business plan and where the company is in relation to the business plan, or if there are any significant developments in the company. So if somebody, unfortunately, looks as if they're about to bring a significant litigation claim against you, or positively, if somebody comes along and expresses an interest in buying the whole of the company, those sorts of things are usually captured by information rights, so that significant shareholders in the company have access and an entitlement to see that information. The other thing that a shareholders agreement governs is decision making. So a company can make decisions either because its board say that they want to follow a particular course of action, or because the Companies Act, the shareholders sort of say they wanted to follow a particular course of action. And the Companies Act determines, in some cases, where those decisions lie. So to change your articles of association, your directors can't decide that. That has to be a shareholder decision. So there will be a bulk of things that fit within shareholder decisions, and then there will be a number of things that fit within director decisions. Director decisions are usually board decisions, day-to-day running of the company stuff, recruitment, expenditure, commercial arrangements. However, there will be some circumstances where investors will want to promote those to being shareholder consent. Now, there will be a number of reasons why they want to do this, not least because they will just want to have a greater degree of control over, for example, significant expenditure, or the company deciding to change its business model and move away from the business plan, sort of significant way. The one thing to bear in mind with that, so you can promote director decisions to shareholder decisions, but you can't demote shareholder decisions as required by the Companies Act down to director decisions. And a really key thing to remember is to go back to directors' duties. So decisions made by directors have to comply with the duties that relate to the overall success of the company for the benefit of the members as a whole, and all of the other avoiding conflicts of interest and all of those other good things that we've talked about in earlier sessions. Whereas shareholders do not have those duties or obligations at all. They can vote entirely at their whim as to what they think is best, quite possibly for them, in those circumstances. So that's something to be really mindful of when you're determining whether board level decisions need to be promoted to shareholder decisions. The other thing with that is also which shareholders have to agree to those decisions, and indeed which directors have to agree to those decisions. And normally you see some terms in there and some concepts in there that say the shareholder decisions have to include the following people in order to sanction that discussion. And that usually comes down to the shape of your cap table and the shape of your investor stakeholder group. And then likewise with board decisions, it's usually, sort of simple majority of the board, which then has to include following people within that decision-making majority. Decision-making is quite a sort of a large part of a shareholders agreement. Like I say, it's an operational document largely. From a personal perspective, in respect of founders, there will be non-compete provisions in a shareholders agreement, so that you can't basically leave the company and go and set up another one, doing the same thing and, steal all the staff. The reason that we have these in a shareholders agreement, as well as in, for example, employment contracts, is because they're enforceable in different ways. So a non-compete in an employment agreement is governed by employment law, whereas the only entity or party that can enforce a restrictive covenant under an employment contract is the company, because it's the counterparty to that. Whereas non-competes in a shareholders agreement are governed by contract law and not by employment law, and can be enforced by the parties who have the benefit of that covenant, which could be the company, but is also likely to be investors as well. So investors can directly enforce non-compete provisions against individuals who leave. And really, really broadly speaking, non-compete provisions in a shareholders agreement are much more likely to be enforceable than non-compete provisions in an employment contract. And then the other thing which has a personal reference point in the shareholders agreement are warranties. Now, I touched on these when I talked about the business plan, but warranties are basically statements of fact, promises that you make about the company before somebody writes a check. And it also gives you an opportunity to get all the skeletons out the cupboard if there are any. So warranties can include things like, on a personal basis, that you aren't disqualified from being a director, that you have no criminal offences, or don't have a criminal record other than motoring offences. And then, in relation to the business will be things like the company isn't involved in litigation, by way of example. The general precept is obviously investors need to be able to make an informed decision about what they are investing in. The consequence, somebody giving warranties, which later proved to be untrue, is that the beneficiary of those warranties, the investors, are able to bring essentially a compensation claim, a damages claim, in relation to the fact that that statement wasn't true. And had they known that statement wasn't true, they either wouldn't have invested or they would have invested at a different valuation. The one thing I would say with warranties is the company will give warranties, and the company can therefore be at the end of the claim from disgruntled investors. But there will also be an expectation that the founders will also give warranties. And those warranties, again, to give you an idea of market norm, there are a number of hurdles that need to be met before an investor can bring a warranty claim. And there are also some caps on what an investor can bring. So normally you would expect to see warranties being somewhere around 18 months. So somebody would have to bring a claim within 18 months. There's usually a de minimis. So, they can't come and bring a claim for, I don't know, they've invested 5 million, but they can't come and bring a claim for 500 quid, by way of example. So that there will normally be a de minimis. And there will also be a maximum amount of liability that they can bring against either the company, which is normally capped at the amount of investment they've made, or in relation to an individual. And in relation to an individual, that is either 1 times salary, would be at this level, fairly market norm. Or it might be a fixed amount. So you might agree that it's £20,000, £50,000, whatever it might be. Whether you go down one route or the other will depend largely on who your founders are, what the relationship with the company is of each of those founders, what the normal requirements of an investor are, a particular investor are, in respect of that. The one thing I would say in respect of warranties is people get quite emotive because there is this, sort of potential personal liability. The way to mitigate that is by doing what we call a disclosure exercise. So the warranties are given as statements of truth at the point in time the investment is made. You have an ability before that to either change those warranties so that you alter them to say that, into a format that it's true. So you might say, for example, the company has no employees, and you'll say, actually, we've got 3. So you'll say for A, B, and C, the company has no employees. So you change the warranty so that it's true. Or you write something called a disclosure letter, which is basically a formal way of informing investors that here are the things that mean that these warranties aren't true. Actually, we have 3 employees. They're called this. Here are their employment contracts. And the way to think about it, I know, again, I laugh with it. In fact, I refer to sport and cars, things that I don't necessarily know anything about. But when I talk about warranties and sort of try and make a reference point, if I'm going to go and buy a car and it's got faulty brakes, I'd rather know before I bought it that it's got faulty brakes. And I either still buy it, but with a discount on the price because I know that it's got, sort of faulty brakes, or I don't. That's what a disclosure exercise does. For me as an investor or a purchaser, that is a much better scenario than buying the car with the faulty brakes and not finding out about it until I'm going downhill and I can't stop, but thinking, oh, well, that's okay, I can bring a compensation claim against somebody. I'd rather know before I bought the car. And investors are exactly the same. So the best way to protect yourself from a warranty claim is to disclose, and quite frankly, investors would welcome disclosure and be somewhat suspicious, I think, if there weren't any disclosures that you wanted to make against warranty. So that's my warranty lecture. The second document is Articles of Association. Now, they're a much more technical document. You'll see lots more legal jargon in there than you will in a shareholders agreement. Articles of Association are filed at Companies House. They're a matter of public record. You can go and find Articles of Association of all of the other portfolio companies of the investor that you're talking to, by way of example, sometimes quite an interesting exercise. You can basically go and find the Articles of Association of any company in the UK, whether a limited company or a PLC. So what do the Articles of Association do then? So Articles of Association sort out what rights attach to the actual share. So what voting rights do you have? What rights do you have to income and dividends and those sorts of things? Who has an entitlement to go to shareholder meetings? How are they going to be held? when's notice going to be given? Who needs to be there in order for it to be a valid meeting? Same with board meetings. Who's entitled to appoint directors to the board? How often a board meeting is going to be held? How much notice is going to be given for those board meetings? And who needs to be there in order for it to be a quorate or valid board meeting? And then you get into sort of some different provisions in there, which again, we very much draw to the attention of any founders, albeit they are entirely conventional in most articles of association. So the first is something called drag and tag provisions. So somebody comes along, they makes an offer for the whole of the company, and all of a sudden you find you've got a 6% shareholder that won't sign any documentation because they've decided that their shares are more, or their signature is more valuable than anybody else's. What a drag provision does is say that when a certain level of shareholders decide they want to sell their shares to a third party, that they are able to drag compulsorily sell the shares of all minority shareholders on the same terms and on the same price, but it just prevents somebody holding everybody else to ransom in the case of an exit. The reverse of a drag along is something called a tag along. So a tag along is where a percentage of shareholders might want to, so there might be a change of control. Somebody wants to come along and, or somebody wants to sell, for example, their controlling stake in a company. And what a tag along does is it gives the option for the remaining shareholders to jump on that bandwagon and also to exit for the same terms and on the same price. There's also something called a co-sell right, which is a derivative of a tag-along, which is where if somebody sells a certain percentage of their shares, then you can also sell a certain percentage of your shares. If somebody sells 10% of their shareholding, you can sell 10% of your shareholding. The other provisions that, again, can get quite emotive are leaver provisions, sometimes called reverse vesting. And again, this is the concept that you will have an amount of shares that are allotted to you on day one. But actually, if you left the company next week, or a co-founder left the company next week, you'd probably be a bit upset because you would be expecting them to sort of stay around to help deliver the business plan and the return that the investors are expecting. And so what reverse vesting or leaver provisions do is set out that in the event that you leave the company within a certain time frame, what happens to your shares? What happens to your shares will depend on whether you are what we call a good leaver or a bad leaver. Really, really broadly speaking, have you chosen to leave the company or has the company forced you out? How long you've been there is another factor that gets brought in. And then from there you say, right, well, okay, you're a good leaver, you left within 12 months, in which case, sort of 50% of your shares vest and 50% of your shares become worthless shares, deferred shares quite often. So that's what leaver provisions do. They need to be really carefully drafted and you absolutely need to understand them. And again, one of the things to think about isn't necessarily how it relates to you. Think about how you would feel if a co-founder left and what you would want to happen to their shares. The same goes with non-competes. Don't necessarily think about it in relation to you, think about it in relation to other people. And then the really sort of quick sort of final thing on it is in relation to protection for investors. So what you will see is we're seeing now more and more is what we call anti-dilution provisions. In the event that you do a down round within a certain period of time, those investors will be issued with additional shares as if they had invested at that lower amount rather than at the higher amount. And the other thing that we are starting to see creep into term sheets largely as a result of economic conditions and market conditions are preference shares, which is where certain shares or a certain class of shares held by investors would be entitled to a preferential dividend. And by that, it's a bit like asking for interest on an investment. So you might have a 6% or 8% interest rate essentially attached to those shares, which then gets paid out either through dividends if the company becomes income generative, or in the event of an exit, there's a grab on those exit proceeds that is equivalent to that cumulative dividend alongside sort of any sort of share of the proceeds which get distributed out of that. The one thing I would say, and this is where it is good to have SEIS and EIS investors, is they cannot have anti-dilutive protection and they cannot have preferential dividends. So this is where EIS becomes a really good source of funding because they basically need to have ordinary shares that ostensibly rank alongside everybody else. So, having talked about the fact that EIS and SEIS are good things to have, I'm going to sort of swiftly move over to Sue, who can sort of chat through sort of some of the tax incentives and the tax considerations that people have when thinking about making an investment.
There are lots of tax issues that you have to think about when you're setting up a company. At the forefront, so at this stage where you're getting investment, people talk a lot, as Nicola has done, about EIS, or the Enterprise Investment Scheme. Now, this was introduced a few years ago by the government to incentivise people to invest in innovation and move the funding of innovation away from central government a little bit, but more into sort of the hands of private individuals. And what was done was to wrap around investment into what are called qualifying companies, and I'll come back to that in a second, a provision which means that investors who are individuals can get tax relief against their income tax in respect to the amount they invest in an innovative qualifying company. And typically, well, certainly under the Enterprise Investment Scheme, which is the first of the schemes to be brought in, that means they get 30%, up to 30% tax incentive against the investment that they make. So you can deduct from your taxable income 30% of that you invest in the innovative company. This was tremendously successful and then led to the introduction of what's called Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme, which was for companies that are really baby companies. So literally at this very spin-out stage, an investor could get 50% tax relief on the investment. So that meant that if they invested £50,000 in the company, they got £25,000 of tax relief, which is pretty good. But for both of those, the real incentive is not actually the income tax relief that an investor gets. It's what's called the capital gains tax relief, which is, and forgive me for being simplistic, some of you may well know this, but capital gains tax is levied where you have a capital growth in an asset that you hold, and shares are deemed to be capital assets. We all hope that when you have a spin out that it doesn't just stay at its £1,000 value that I was talking about earlier, but that it grows and grows and grows and becomes really valuable, and it ends up with an exit valuation when the company is sold at, let's say, £1 million. So there's a capital gain there of £1 million less the 1,000, which then falls to be taxed under capital gains tax. If you've got EIS status, so the investment that you made was made under Enterprise Investment Scheme, you don't pay any tax at all on that gain. And that can be, that is a really, really valuable opportunity for people. And it has remained like that pretty much since inception, which is unusual for tax legislation, I have to say, and tax incentives. But it's because it has been so successful at incentivising investment into companies. There are lots of rules around this, and I could talk for hours on those particular rules, but I think it's important to just bear in mind a few highlights, if you like. Firstly, the company has got to be what's called a qualifying company. Now, most tech startups will be because they're involved in an innovative area. It's not possible, for example, for firms of accountants or lawyers to be able to attract investment under EIS, or indeed insurance companies or banking companies and things like that. But certainly, you should all be okay in terms of the company qualifying. The other thing that you have to watch for is that no one person who is seeking to get EIS relief or SEIS relief can own more than 30% of the shares in the company at any one time. Now, in the early days, it meant you couldn't also have loaned the company. So if you took your loan and your share capital investment as well together, together they could not total 30% of the share capital of the company. And that did prove to be a bit complex for people and cause a few problems when people suddenly realised that perhaps when the company was struggling a bit and they sort of lent it a few thousand to get on with, that they thereby had ruined their chances of getting their EIS capital gains tax relief later on down the road. Other things are that the company must continue to be a qualifying company for 3 years, and that you can't have an exit under 3 years, because otherwise, again, you can compromise the EIS. Now, the qualifying company bit is the bit that is important for you as innovators and founders of your businesses to just be aware of, that if you've got EIS or SEIS investors, that you don't then screw up their tax, because they get very miffed about that. And screwing up their tax could be done by, for example, the company becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of another entity, or taking most of their activity overseas. And as I say, there are lots of rules around this, and you know, it's not so straightforward. The other thing I would say, that companies don't always know whether they're going to qualify, or indeed whether the particular round that they've structured of investment will be able to be a qualifying round. And I mean that because, you know, we could, for example, and Nicola was talking about preference shares. You could have an issue if you've got too many preference shares within the company, or indeed preference shares at all in the company. That could compromise your ability to get enterprise investment scheme relief for your other investors. So what many companies choose to do before they get the investment in is to make an application to HMRC to say, can you give us advance clearance? This is the structure that we're planning. These are the articles of association we'll have. This is the shareholder agreement that we will have. Can you please give us advance assurance? And on the basis of those particular facts, then the revenue will give assurance. Now, one of the problems with that is that it doesn't happen overnight. Those of you who have been fortunate or unfortunate enough to have negotiations or discussions with the revenue would know that it does take some time for them to come forward with opinions and so on. And typically we're looking at at the moment, we're looking at around 6 weeks for that to come through. Now, in the context of the whole journey of your investment and so on, that might not seem a very long time. But if you've got a mix of investors, which is not unusual, so you might have, for example, an institution who are wanting to invest in you. Now, they wouldn't be getting EIS relief because they're not individuals. You might have, a bunch of individuals, and you might have what's called a venture capital trust, who might have an EIS fund, by which I mean that they've got a range of individuals who invest into companies through a bigger fund, and that would also attract EIS. But you can have competing tensions then, because the institution or the venture capitalist who doesn't have EIS status, or won't be looking for EIS status, may just want to get the deal done quickly, and they don't necessarily want to sit and wait for 6 weeks. Whereas the EIS investors may well want this advanced clearance. So you're going to be balancing those different competing interests in terms of timetable. I think Nicola will probably agree with me that sometimes there's a bit of a dust up around all of this, and there, you've got the non-EIS people shouting and screaming and saying we want to get the money in, and the business got to get going, and the founders saying we want the business to get going, and then the EIS guys standing outside and saying no, we've got to get this advance assurance. But in practice, by the time everything is sorted, the 6 weeks goes fairly quickly, and actually doesn't make any material difference overall in the majority of situations. Those are the really valuable tax incentives, and they're valuable not just to the investor, but also to you as the company, because it just accesses sort of money that otherwise wouldn't be available. Oh, somebody said they just got advance assurance in only 8 days from submission. Well, that's brilliant. And, there are outliers that do manage to get it. We say 6 weeks just to sort of manage people's expectations a bit. And it very much depends on who you get as the person in the revenue who's responsible for your case. But that's really good news to hear and encouraging. The only final thing I'd want to add to the mix on EIS and SEIS is that there is a mythology that is built up that it's possible for founders to get EIS and SEIS on their investment in the company. And I say mythology because it used to be possible that, despite the revenue saying, the rules being very clear, that if you're a participant in the company, so you're an employee, then you couldn't get it. Then there were certain routes that people used to adopt to get it, but it is becoming more challenging now. And I think you have to basically feel that you're not going to get that relief. One of the hiccups I think around that in particular was that at one point there used to be if you were a director, for example, a participant in the company, you could put in, they would say, as long as you put in a meaningful amount of cash, as opposed to just having your shares initially, and they actually put a number on that, that would sort of probably be okay. But now it just says the word meaningful, and that the interpretation of that depends really very, very much on the individual inspector. And, we're finding that their interpretation of meaningful means that it has to be transformative to the business. So it's not £5,000, it could be 20, it could be 30,000, and you don't know until you get to the point at which you unwind it. So I don't think it's something that one should really be looking at the moment. We should be looking at EIS and SEIS very much for our investors.
Can I just add something on the process with regards to advanced assurance?
Yes,
because I think the other thing that we see are companies coming to us waiving an advanced assurance that they've got off the back of model articles before they've even spoken to an investor. Quite frankly, that advanced assurance isn't worth the paper it's written on. The advanced assurance or the relief is actually only available in relation to the documentation and the rights attaching to the shares that exist at the point of investment. So waiving a set of model articles in front of HMRC and them saying, yes, that looks like it would qualify for advanced assurance or qualify for EIS, genuinely isn't worth the paper it's written on. And most investment funds, because you get investment funds that are EIS investment funds, will require advanced assurance based on the final form documentation or near final form documentation. So waving around we've got advanced assurance on the back of documents which haven't been agreed with investors largely is a waste of time and money. Most investment funds will build into the process that you get advanced assurance based on the documents they're actually going to sign and be bound by. There are different ways of baking that into the process. You don't necessarily have to wait until you get to the final documents, although there are some funds who require that. Most of the time, you can get to the point where actually all of the things that would impact EIS or SEIS are agreed and make the submission based on that, and then leave the things that don't relate to EIS, like how many people you're going to have on the board or non-compete provisions, to still be determined while you're waiting for that assurance to come back. And there's also, which we now do fairly regularly as well, an ability to split completions, so that what you do is you can have non-EIS shareholders putting in their investment on day one, and then you can have EIS shareholders putting in their investment later when the advanced assurance is received. And that's the only condition, that they just need to receive advanced assurance. What you do need to do there, however, is be really careful about who owns what shares after that first investment, because if you've got somebody who has tipped over the 50% by reason of the fact that not everybody has put their money in on day one, then actually the company isn't going to be qualifying by the fact that you've got somebody owning more than 50%. And so, kind of there is, or indeed if you've got existing EIS investors, what you again need to be alive to is that you don't do something that tips them over their 30%. So it can be done, but like I say, the amount of times I see companies coming and telling me they've got advanced assurance, and I'm just like, great. But actually most investment funds, and indeed sophisticated angels, will require advanced assurance based on the actual documentation rather than just something you've pulled off a shelf.
Excellent. So lots to think about, and this is why we would always encourage you to work with professional suppliers like Sue and Nicola. Other firms exist, just to make sure that you're not falling foul of any of these, because I can tell you that if you accidentally EIS somebody who was depending on it, you will probably never raise a penny again. So, okay, a few questions have popped in. What are some of the areas where startups should be looking for investors to add value beyond just capital?
Really good question, Sam. I mean, I think it's around their expertise within the sector that you're in. And very often that will come from business angels, individuals who are coming in. Also, as the company progresses, it's really good to have people on as investors who have been investors in similar businesses to yourselves, and therefore can help you to direct your business such that it becomes as successful as possible. So they're inputting expertise at the board level as well, because very often you'll get strategic investors who will have a seat at the board as well. So I think it's credibility and experience.
And I wouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. Is my, whenever I meet companies, getting 15 shareholders, that's a bit of a nightmare, or 15 investors, because that really becomes herding cats territory. However, in terms of investors, I would always suggest that you get 2 to 3 investors to come in, because you want to create that means 2 to 3 little black books of contacts and of experience. And also, if you then want them to, follow on at a later round, it means that you're not in the hands of one organisation. So, if a fund decides that actually they're not really that interested in quantum anymore, and you're a quantum company, then you're a little bit stuck. Whereas actually, if you've got 2 or 3 investors, and actually 1 out of the 3 decides they don't want to do quantum anymore, you've still got 2 who are really engaged and will help you bridge that round. So definitely a diversity of investors, both in terms of it may be investment size and expertise and what they can bring to the table. And also that means more investor directors, and they will keep each other in check. And it's much easier to let them keep each other in check than you try to do that as founder directors.
Yes, so it's definitely worth having useful triangulation, but you don't want to become a hexagon, I think, is probably the way of viewing this. Nicola, Sue, our next activity is, of course, a party. A workshop.
A working party. 9th of June, 4 p.m. here at Buxton Court, which is where AUI is based, and also where I'm based, and just down the road from Sue. Our plan is to make you work for your beer. And so we will put you sort of into teams or across different tables and post some scenarios for you to then feed back to the group what you would do in that situation, or pose questions to you. We have a number of investment funds coming who will also be prepared to put an investor director perspective on the scenarios, as well as some CEOs as well. Again, who many of you will be familiar with, who are quite happy to come and again share their experiences. And then after we've made you work, we will all head across to sort of Tap Social and chill a bit and get to know each other in person rather than on a screen.
The next cluster will be taking place. We'll send out details to everybody. Again, spread it far and wide. We want as many people as possible to benefit from this. So do share with your friends. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Sue, for your, as usual, deep wisdom and sane knowledge. And we'll look forward to meeting you all, or most of you, shortly for the final workshop in this cluster.